Hi, this is Celeste, and this is 10 Minutes of History. So last time we were talking about Richard Henry Dana, his book, 2 years before the mast, which he wrote in the 1830s from his diary on his experiences aboard the Pilgrim. And so about 92 days into this trip, after they have just gone around the Horn, they encounter a whaling ship. And so that kind of brings up the subject of whaling on our coast. And there actually was whaling in California. It was pretty rare. It was mainly in the middle of the 19th century. Primarily whaling was done on the East Coast out of Nantucket. And so those were the big whaling centers. The reason they sent whaling boats to California was because the otter trade was ramping up. And so they sent those boats over here to collect otter pelts. What happened is not long after they got here, they regulated the otter industry, and so they were not allowed to collect otter pelts anymore, and so they went back to whaling. So mostly they whaled up in the San Francisco area, but they did eventually end up whaling out of 3 land ports, which was Point Conception, San Pedro, and San Diego. They had motherships out in the ocean where if they did catch a whale, they would take it to the mothership and process it there. And they had the killer ships, which would bring it in, or they would take it to the land, but mostly they did it from the motherships offshore. What this brings up, and the reason I'm bringing this subject up, is that because Bill Stewart, who is in charge of our veterans here at the museum, has his collection of whaling and sailing crafts here at the museum. And so I just kind of wanted to explain those to you and explain to you how these sailors had time to do this. So last time we talked about the dog watches on the sailing ships, and you would have had that on the whaling ships as well. And during the dog watch time, everyone is up on the deck at the same time. And especially if the weather is good, you did have some time when you were off your watch, when you were up on deck, and you had some time to work on these crafts, if that's what you wanted to do. Also, Sundays. On Sunday, you had your watch, but when you were off watch, you had free time. So you could also work on these things on Sundays, and this would be something you would maybe want to do so that when you finally did get home years later, you had something to bring back to the wife or the children. So the different things that could be done with the supplies that were on the boat was, we'll start here in the middle with Scrimshaw. So you had whale teeth. This is basically a raw whale tooth. This is what it looked like when it came straight out of the whale. And then when it's polished up, it has this nice shiny white surface. And what they did was scratch a beautiful design into the tooth, and then fill that with ink, rub it out, and keep filling that until the ink was embedded in the scratch, and then you repolished it up, and you had this beautiful design inside. And that's what we have in here. These are Scrimshaws that Bill collected. The other thing that you could do is you could make animals out of the lines, the rope, the junk rope. We talked about that last time too. So you can see on this mane of this lion here, that was purchased by Bill, made by an unknown Danish sailor. But the mane is basically the oakum, the little bits that come off the line that we talked about before. Bill made the other 2 little animals himself based on his purchase of the lion, so that he knew how to do that. Another craft that was prevalent at that time was ship in a bottle. So of course you built that entire ship outside the bottle in a state that it would collapse. People still do it today. And then you tucked it into the bottle and had rigging set up, so if you could just pull a string, the rigging would come up, and then you could set it in there. So he collected a lot of these too. Something he didn't collect but made himself was this rope work. And rope work was something that you made in your free time. You could make yourself a belt, and you would use the scrap line, the junk ropes around. It may be something that you had spun. He's got a trivet back here that he made. He has chest handles for putting on your chest, which we have a chest right here. Buttons, these would have been buttons on a coat. And then he has a nice telescope here where the rope work is done. He did this rope work around this telescope that came off of a ship that he salvaged. And then there's some tools over here that you'd use in the rope work. So awls and different things that you could separate them in the grading processes. So these are the things that you could do during that dog watch or on Sunday, so that you had something of your own personal time to do. The watches, like we talked about, the 4 hours on and the 4 hours off, it was tedious work, and it was dark. And even they're up, like the second day he's on this trip straight out of Boston, there's a storm, and they send him up in aloft, up to the top of the sails to reef the sails. He doesn't know anything. He's just up there, and he is seasick as can be, and he's just a mess. And I don't know if you've ever been aloft on a tall ship, but I can't even imagine him not feeling good. It's pitch black dark because in the storm, you don't have a moon. There's no light at all. And he's up there fumbling, trying to figure out what he's going to do to reef these sails. And so his description in the book, again, I encourage you to read this book if you haven't read it, because he describes things so well. It's just the whole thought of him doing this on this watch, and then just telling you all the daily tasks that they have to do on these different watches. Now, back to the whaling. So as we're at the very end of the whole whaling industry, the reason we have to do whaling initially is because we need whale oil, which is in the head of the whale, and primarily for oil, for the light oil, but mainly light oil for lighthouses, because you need a really bright light, and there was no other blubber that could make that light as bright as whale oil. So when electricity is finally invented, we don't need whale oil anymore, and that's really the whole end of the whaling industry. But it's not the end of the whaling industry in California. Interestingly enough, they decided that if you lived in Iowa, say, you'd probably never seen a whale. So they continued to hunt and capture whales, and they put them on flatbed train cars or trucks, and they drove them into the interstates as novelties so that people could see what a whale looked like. Now, you had a very short amount of time to do that because a whale was really too big to preserve, so you really had to get that whale into those states and buried as soon as you could because it would decay very quickly. There's some very interesting pictures that we have with bathing beauties. It's standing in the mouth of a whale, and the posters that are advertising that this whale is coming to your town. And I'm sure everybody came down to see that whale because you'd never seen one. It was quite a sight, and especially to see it on the back of a truck. I'm sure that it looked quite huge. So we also have a chest here that was also made by Bill Stewart. And the interesting part about this is it just represents the total amount of stuff you could bring with you when you were signed on to this ship for 2 years. So you can imagine if you had a change of clothes, sometimes you didn't, but anything that you needed, your personal items had to fit in this chest. And interestingly enough, like the first day that Dana was on the boat, his chest got broken because they had laid a heavy anchor line on top of it, and in the dark it just kind of splattered all over the steerage area, so everything he had just went every different direction. But this is a beautifully made chest, and it brings home the size of what you could bring with you and what you could take. When you made these things, they would go back in your chest so that they were kept safe until you could get back home. You wouldn't want to put your wet clothes in here, and you were wet a good part of the time, and there was no way to really dry things out. I know that if you were in the forecastle, you could hang your clothes, but where Dana was originally when he was in the steerage, you couldn't drive nails in there, so their clothes were just sitting on the sails and didn't dry, and so the smell in there must have been lovely smell of mildew and wet wool and everything that they had. So they were cold, they were really cold, and after they had rounded the Horn, it was snowing down there. So there was one day where he wakes up for his watch and there's snow all over the deck. So the one thing to look forward to twice a day, breakfast and dinner, was that you got a tin of tea, hot tea, and with a little molasses in it. That with a biscuit and some salted beef. The problem was getting it from the galley down to your down to steerage or the forecastle in order to eat it. Sometimes he stood for like 10 minutes at the top of the stairs waiting for the ship to stop moving so he could make it. If you fell and spilled it, dropped it, it would go all over the place and you did not get another allotment. So sometimes the guys would pitch in and give you a little more. So that's about it. That's 10 minutes and we'll see you next time.